Isn't this beautiful? A plump, ripe tomato. Well, today I'm going to show you how to take 20 to 25 pounds of these beautiful plump tomatoes and turn them into this, jars of crushed tomatoes that will last you for up to a year. I'm also going to show you how to take the dried skins from the tomato and turn them into a tomato spice, and also how to get tomato water out of the leftovers. So let's get started. Welcome back to Barbara's Kitchen. I'm glad you've joined us today because we are going to can crushed tomatoes. Now let me tell you what I did in terms of getting the tomatoes. I went to my local farmer's market and I asked for a box of seconds. Now seconds are tomatoes that are not picture perfect. They may in fact have some slight bruising on them, but they're just as good to use. You're going to need about 20 to 25 pounds of tomatoes to fill 6 to 8 quart jars or 12 to 16 pint jars. So let's talk about your canning essentials that you're going to need. You'll need your jar lifter, your headspace tool, your funnel, and your ladle. And for tomatoes, you need citric acid as part of the canning process. And gloves. This is what happened to the gloves that I used this past weekend. So the process that we're going to use today comes from Kathy Barrow, Mrs. Wheelbarrow, who is my canning guru now. Kathy has shown me that it's not that difficult to can food. It takes a little bit of time, but it's pretty easy. So let me show you how to do this. So the first thing you have to do is blanch the tomatoes in boiling hot water in order to soften the skin so they'll peel away. Before you stick them in the water, make sure to slice an X into the bottom of each tomato. So the tomatoes should sit in the boiling hot water for only about a minute. They should start to float, or else you'll start to see the slits that we set up start to peel away a little. That's when they're ready. So this is where I'm going to need to put on my trusty plastic gloves. As you can see, we've got the tomatoes, they're blanched, and the peels are coming away. So you just peel away the peel. So the next step that I like to do is to core out the middle of the tomato so you don't have to deal with that. Keep your waste in a separate bowl, just as you've kept your skins in a separate bowl, and we're going to show you what to do with those later. I then cut my tomatoes in half and I use my fingers to pull out the gel and the seeds. As you see, I've already got a quart-size container of crushed tomatoes, or tomatoes being prepped for crushing and canning here. So I've already got 3 quarts of tomatoes boiling in this heavy-duty cast iron pan. When it starts to boil again, I'm going to add another quart to the pot, which is what you should do. Add your tomatoes a quart at a time so that you will know how many quarts of tomatoes you're going to have to process. So again, I'm adding another quart of tomatoes into the boiling batch that I'd already started. So I've got now 4 quarts of tomatoes in here. I then have to mash the tomatoes. With each quart, you want to mash the tomatoes to get out as much juice as you can. So now that I've added the final quart of tomatoes and mashed them, we have to let this batch boil for 5 minutes. So now it's time to put our tomatoes that have been boiling into the jars to get ready for processing. So we take our jars that have been warmed. Again, you want to warm your jars before you put this hot liquid into them. And we fill the jars, leaving at least a ½ inch headspace at the top of the jar. So you can use this little handy headspace tool to figure out if you've got a ½ inch. Tomatoes can be very acidic, so the best way to manage the acid levels is to add a ¼ teaspoon of citric acid to the pint jars or a ½ teaspoon to the quart jars. An important step that you cannot forget to do, and that is take a damp paper towel or a damp cloth and clean the rim all the way around. If there is residue on the top of any of the jars, it won't seal correctly. Then we're ready to put the lids on and the rings. Put the rings on only loosely, sort of like a loose fit, but not tight. So the final step is to begin processing each jar of tomatoes. So you put each jar into your canner, and they must boil for 35 minutes for the pint jars, 45 minutes for the quart jars. And then you turn the heat off and let the jar sit inside the canner for 10 more minutes. So now that you've finished processing your crushed tomatoes and they're all on your counter, you will know that you have been successful when you hear that wonderful little ping. And that means that each jar has sealed successfully. If you haven't heard that little ping sound, it means your jar is likely not sealed successfully. So you have two options. You can process the jar for another 35 minutes or simply put that jar into the refrigerator and use those crushed tomatoes in your cooking. So go out and get a bunch of tomatoes while they're abundant and try canning your own crushed tomatoes. These will last for at least a year. So here's what you can do with the leftover tomato skins. Take each one, lay it out on a single layer on a parchment-covered cookie sheet, stick them in the oven at 200 degrees for about 2 hours, and they dry out and become dried tomato skins. Throw them into your food processor or a grinder, and you've got tomato spice. And the leftover scraps from pulling out the tomato gel and seeds, you just simply put this into a fine mesh strainer, you swish it around, and you have tomato water. You can use it with cooking rice, beans, or as a vegetable broth, or simply to drink. It's really pretty good. I hope you enjoyed this. Try it. It's easy.